Hi, folks. This video is going to talk about the material for week 10, which will be our first week going remote as I recover, as I have my procedure and recover. This is being recorded in advance. Um, and you may or may not be able to hear the wind chimes in the background and so forth. I apologize if that is distracting. But we'll talk about the material for week 10. It's this the course material is slightly controversial depending on your point of view, depending on your experiences therewith. But I'm going to go ahead and screen share. We're going to go to uh, we are going to take a look at, let's see what we got here. Our course page, or a page very, very similar to yours if this isn't your exact class. But um, so the readings for this week, as you know, if you did the reading notes in advance and so forth, um, they deal with notions of grading and grammar, and these are subjects that really are sticking points for a lot of folks. A lot of folks come off, you know, one way or the other on this. And if you're doing the project that asks you to delve into grading and how one should be assessed and so forth uh, in high school or college, then really this is Sal Anoy article. Um, where does grading come from is a really good place to sort of begin your investigation. Of course, he's got a works cited on there and it points you to different directions, but his general premise is that grading is a relatively recent phenomenon, particularly um, the standards by which we grade. And he argues that it's rooted in assumptions about social standing, right? And he uses Harvard as an example. He talks about the original um, grading system at Harvard was based upon one's family social standing. So people were grouped into various tiers um, based on who their families were. And because it was assumed that if you came from a certain family, you were basically pre-qualified, right? That you were going to do well because that's who you were. Very much it's very much in keeping with an old European idea, the divine right of kings and so on and so forth, that if one was born into wealth, that that was somehow a gift from God, etc., and so on. And so one was destined, right, to be successful. Um, so he talks about that sort of phenomenon, and he talks about how the first sort of articulation of gradation among grades was sort of like exemplary, um, um, uh, pass, pass, and then not pass, right? And the vast majority of the folks would end up in the first two categories. Again, with the assumption that if one was there in the first place, then one was sort of meant to be among the elite and so forth. Um, and there's a real hearkening back to European system there, as I said, um, because frankly, a lot of the folks that, well, first of all, schools like Harvard and so on were they were essentially founded as training ground for ministers. But beyond that, the original professoria of Harvard and the schools on the East Coast and so forth, they were all European, right? They were all British and or European, and so this was the system they were coming out of. And in a way, what uh, those schools were doing, even though it was very limited, right, is that they were offering a bit of democratization to these folks, these students who were from the British colonies and then from the States, right, as time progressed. And so, whereas those students wouldn't have gotten access in Great Britain to some of the echelons, right, or Europe to some of the echelons that the traditional, say, um, royal or classes would have, royal or noble classes would have. But because in America they may not have been noble per se, but they had money, right? Money became money became the indicator of nobility, if you will, in America. And there's a lot to be said about that even now. But anyway, that's the that's the original basis for grading, and we even we see this, even now, as early as 10, 15 years ago in Japan. um Basically the idea was the Japanese high school is so rigorous, or their equivalent to high school is so rigorous, that the idea was is that you as a student, you work yourself near to death through to high school. But once you crack that ceiling, if you will, and you go to college, you basically party, right, for your extent of your college time, and you basically get, for lack of a better term, socially promoted, right? Um, so stuff like that exists, right? Uh, so um, what Hanoi is essentially saying is that grading is a construct. Well, he uses a term. He says grading is a technology, right? And the technology of grading is not necessarily representative of one's knowledge per se, or one's ability. What he's arguing is it never has been. Um, you know, um, he raises some interesting points here, and to his credit, he includes some dissenting opinions um, at the end of his piece. And what this is it's um, um, so blog post, right? It's posts from his blog that he's carrying on this discussion, and he includes some people that raise some issues about what he's saying. And so to his credit, he is doing that. Um, so yeah, he's not just kind of speaking in a vacuum. He's allowing for other ideas to come into play as well. Um, when he talks about, and I may be getting my articles muddled here, but something else from this week talked about land grants. Land grant at school. Actually, yeah, it was the Onoi piece, because he talks about the history of education in Oregon, right? And Oregon uh, did a lot as a territory and as a state to deny access, not only deny access to education, but to deny access to land, to owning a land and so forth, to African Americans and so forth. And he points to that. He says that that's why. Again, this is a noise assessment. This is not, you know, I don't know that any other scholars have taken this up. This is not my field, as far as that. But he says that that's a reason why the state is still only about 2% black. But anyway, these essentially anti-black laws were repealed in the mid 1920s and so forth. But they um, this uh, the sort of impetus or uh, thrust of ideology was prevalent until probably at least through mid 20th century or later. But um, he talks about land grant schools and coming around in the 1860s, and really they were to give access. They were lands, and he says, lands taken away from native tribes and so forth. But the idea is that there were lands granted to essentially for education, lands granted by the government for the purpose of education, uh, such that, and particularly in the areas of agriculture, mathematics, and so forth, and and for the sake of allowing for education for folks that didn't have access to it. Now, Inouye's criticism of that is that it was essentially intended for whites. Um, Now, in the A&M system, we have a really great history. I mean, so here again, we have schools forming like 150 or more years ago based on land grants, the big ones being A&M College Station. Clemson is another one that hits. You have a huge football rivalry between Clemson and A&M. I've taught for both systems, so to me, it's kind of silly. Both stellar, absolutely stellar uh, university systems, but I think the whole rivalry is silly. But anyway, but what the rivalry comes out of is it comes out of the building of tradition, right? And that building of tradition is very similar to the tradition building at Harvard and so forth, where folks that would have been denied education in sort of this landed gentry nobility uh, scenario in Europe, right? Uh, in the United States to develop new traditions, but essentially, it's these traditions can still feel like the in versus the out, right? And so Hanoi is calling that into question in terms of access, in terms of access to education. Um, but one could very easily argue that A&M San Antonio flips that on its head, right? Because the whole point of A&M San Antonio's Senator Madla wanted essentially a land grant school um, um, on the south side of San Antonio to serve the residents, primarily the residents of the south side. Um, and and that's what the school has been doing, right, for the past 15, almost 16 years, right? So again, you have the system that Hanoi is saying, is racist or was racist. And you have someone like Senator Matala coming in and using that system to advance folks folks of color who were, you know, essentially denied education, denied easy access to education prior, right? So, but going back to the notion of grading, um, you know, I don't find what I mean, personally, and again, I've spent close to 30 years. I mean, if you count all the years I spent as a student, I've spent, well over 30 years in academia. And I don't find what he's saying to be uh, all that remarkable in the sense that I've experienced that, right? I mean, um, grades have been used for better or worse as gatekeepers, right? Um, there are, and some of you who are researching your particular fields of study, you might come across courses particular course offerings that other students or even instructors might tell you, this is a quote unquote weed out course. Um, that's what it was called back in my day, right? When I was an undergraduate, especially go the weed out courses. And what a weed out course was, and probably still is in certain institutions, and I can't speak for every major here at Tamusa and so forth, but a weed out course is a course that is made incredibly difficult, intentionally difficult, uh, you know, so that essentially it's a hazing process. You essentially knock folks out of the running to be in the upper division classes by way of these courses that are made intentionally difficult. Now, is that ethical? Uh, there's various different ways to look at that. It is a very common academic practice. Um, Also, it is pretty much a given in a lot of graduate programs that you're most people are not going to make below an A, right? It's rare for somebody to make below an A in a graduate class. Um, I've done it. I made a C in 18th century literature. If you read 18th century literature, you will know why. In my opinion, it's not the most exciting stuff. You got to, you know, um, no offense to anybody that likes Robert Burns or Alexander Pope, but to me, it's not the most exciting stuff. And uh, anyway, so C's can happen, B's can happen, but rarely is there anything below an A in a graduate class? Part of that is that the part of the assumption is that if someone's going to enter a graduate program, they're going to be, self-motivated and driven, and they're going to rise to the occasion. But it's also, I would argue that there is probably, depending on the program, there's probably a sense of, well, these are our folks. This is the next generation. Um, you know, uh, they made it here, therefore they are A quality students. So we will award them an A. I think there's probably some of that. And I can guarantee that I've seen that in my time when I was in graduate school. Okay. I've also seen stuff in graduate school that and I would argue probably still goes on, that you don't necessarily see um, in undergraduate classes, like a professor straight up calling out a student and calling them stupid in class, right? You don't see that in undergraduate classes, and you shouldn't. Graduate classes arguably are a little different because the idea is that when someone is in a graduate program, you are essentially training colleagues. You are training the people with whom you will work on a professional level. And so a lot of the uh, veneer drops, right? Um, so that you're essentially at a certain point, you're senior colleagues and junior colleagues sitting in a room together trying to figure stuff out. And so sometimes emotions can can fly, right? And so there is that. But as far as getting back to the grading idea, yeah, um, I would more or less I would agree with what Hanoi is, essentially what a lot with the core idea that Hanoi has here. And part of that is he's saying that the problem with traditional grading is that it's centered on an idea of whiteness. Um, I'm not going to say much about that other than, but if you look at the history of colonialism, you look at the history and so on of Europe, and then America affecting European ideals and so on and so forth. That that's all you really need to delve into with that. Um, but interestingly, and I again, he he's he doesn't, at least in as much of the piece that I looked at, he did not really engage with the dissenting voices so much, but he put them there, and there were a couple of comments that showed up at the end of the document, that the screen capture or whatever from the blog post. So um, he's allowing for the presence of those dissenting voices. One of the dissenters said that, and this was, I believe, a person of color. I don't know for a fact, but I believe that the name suggested, and again, this could be my own prejudice coming in, or my own preconception. I should say more preconception than prejudice, but the name sounded like someone of Middle Eastern or Indian descent. Uh, but basically, this person argued that um, white, and this is true over time, that who has been considered white at one time is different, right? It changes. Like what whiteness encompasses changes over time. Um, Whiteness, when Harvard was founded in the United States, was essentially um, quite literally white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? The whole impetus for public education, Inouye argues, in the United States, was to essentially make everybody Protestant, or give everyone a Protestant education, and thereby have them lean towards Protestantism. I argue that that was quite successful, even if one is Roman Catholic or Jewish, or practices Sanatana Dharma or Buddhism or Islam, Wicca, what have you, right? Or atheism, right? Whatever one practices, I argue that one's underlying and sort of subconscious theology is in fact old school Calvinistic, because that is the underwriting of our culture from the he mentions in this piece Nathaniel Hawthorne. It's from Nathaniel Hawthorne on up. It's from Jonathan Edwards to Nathaniel Hawthorne, all the way up to the present day. And that's where we get, and I'm not going to parcel all this out, but that's where we get prosperity gospel. That's where we get, um, a lot of stuff that we as Americans wrestle with in various ways. Okay, is from Calvinism, and it's rooted in this idea of, well, we'll just educate the Catholicism out of them. We'll just educate the um, Native Americanness out of them. We'll just, and so on and so forth. And you saw this attempt as well um, in India, right, with the British, and all over actually, where the British colonized and so forth. Um, but anyway, so Inouye is calling that into question. Uh, but on the other side of that, the flip side of that, is okay. Our grading system has some really insidious roots in some ways, some classist roots, some potentially racist roots, et cetera, and so on, some sexist roots. After all, what's the name of the degree that everyone is pursuing? A bachelor's degree. What's a bachelor? It's a single man. Right? And speaking of grading, well into the 1980s, in a lot of universities, it was assumed and even practiced uh, that a young woman was going to college to get a quote unquote MRS degree, meaning that she was going to college to find a husband, and that was that. You can even read Sandra Cisneros, her big saving grace in the short story Only Daughter. Her big saving grace with her relationship with her father was that he didn't care that she majored in poetry and literature, poetry, because all that he really cared about is she go to college and find a husband. He didn't care what she majored in. And so with regard to grading and other things like that and vocational choices and things like that, for women it wasn't um, women weren't really taken seriously in academia for a long, well, really, I mean, there are always exceptions, but really from the 70s, beginning in the 70s and then really up through the 90s and so on and so forth, that really changed. But the assumption was for a long time that a woman was coming to college to find a husband. That was, of course, absolutely, of course, not always the case. Sometimes it was, right? And I say that because I know of folks that's exactly what women, that's exactly what they did. But that was not always the case. And quite frankly, a whole lot of women scholars are superior to a whole lot of male scholars. In fact, I don't think that gender is a determining factor in how rigorous a scholar one is, right? I don't know that gender is a determinant factor there. But um, women, I was in graduate classes where the women in the graduate classes were not initially taken as seriously as the men, right? I had a friend say about a woman colleague in the class. I thought she was just a, housewife uh, taking a class here and there, which that was not the case of this particular scholar that I'm speaking of, who now holds a PhD as well as at least a couple of and a master's degree in another field, and so on and so, you know, and that the time frame I'm speaking of was the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, right? So that's not that far removed. Okay, so people are still making these assumptions, and and my point being is that oftentimes those assumptions get codified in how one is graded, right? That's kind of a noise um, point here. But what I was getting to was that some people may acknowledge, right, the problems with the origins of our grading system, and so on and so forth. But some people may say, well, okay, but there has to be some kind of way of universally acknowledging one's progress, one's ability, one's achievement, and so forth. Um, in theory, I might agree with that. However, in practice, um, not all universities are equal. Not all curriculum is equal, um, and so on. So, you know, I don't know. That's that is for you all to explore, and for you all to come to a particular conclusion and to provide evidence for that conclusion, right? If you pursue that particular project, right? If you pursue the project of this is how writing should be assessed in the college or high school classroom setting, right? But again, a noise article is a really good starting point, whether you agree with him or not, right? And it is possible to agree with some of what he's saying and not all of what he's saying. That's kind of where I sit. I agree in principle with a lot of what he's saying, but is he going too far, as it were, or is he not considering other realities? And that remains to be seen. The jury's out, right? Okay. Um, Really nice article. Is your grammar rule probably fake? And if you read that article, the answer is probably yes, in the sense that it probably was originally not a part of the English language. Um, People, so they the distinction that a lot of the articles this week are making, right? There's grammar and there's punctuation. So grammar has to do with the ordering of words to make your sentences, et cetera, make sense, right? So like syntax. Punctuation has to do with nuance, right? It has to do with context and nuance of how something is to be read to make sense. Everybody's, seen the meme, I'm sure, of let's eat, comma, grandma, or let's eat grandma, right? Two different two different meanings entirely, right? So that's really what they're getting at. But they um the article on your grammar rule is probably fake points out that at various points within the history of the English language, um, and this is not even taking into account the Battle of Hastings and William the Conqueror. And so I'll just back up. So this is a very, very brief history of the evolution of the English language. So in 1066, right, William the Conqueror comes over from Normandy, invades, becomes king of England, and immediately a whole bunch, like 10,000 French words are flushed into the English language, and that becomes the language of like the court, right? It becomes the language of the gentry. Is French and or English that is infused with French. Um, Beyond that, you had legal documents and so on and so forth. As they were in Europe, you had those starting to be kept and so forth in Latin. So you had liturgical and legal documents in Latin, and then you had Old English, which is its own creature, as it were. I can tell you, I took Old English in college. I was certified in it. This is well over 20 years ago. I know one phrase in Old English now, obstakota me, which means kill me, right? So the point being is that you know the Battle of Hastings changes the English language, and from there to the present day, you have constant infusing of new material, right? Mostly, and a lot of it has to do with cultural shifts. A lot of it has to do with technology. Um, but For example, in keeping with that, right, a lot of the grammar rules that you may have heard, like for example, the uh, is your grammar rule probably fake? Points out splitting infinitives, points out ending sentences with prepositions and things like that. Stuff that I was taught, no, you don't do that. Right? You don't do that. But what this is pointing out is that basically at some point some grammarians got together and they said, well, we want English to sound more um, valid, right? To sound more European, um, to be of more value. And so for them, that was to make it sound more Latin, make it sound more Latin. So what they did is they infused a whole lot of Latin grammatical rules onto the English language, and it made it sound, look and sound weird. Like that's why you have the rules of no splitting infinitives and so on and so forth. And they do a nice job of bearing that out in that article. Punctuation and its rhetorical effects, really good article. It's a really nice way of looking at grammar and so forth without having to do quote unquote grammar drills, right? Where you go through what passive voice is, you go through what um, uh, how to use commas and semicolons and all this, which we could do. Chat GPT will teach you that too, though. But what it's really talking about is where and how punctuation is valuable, and it goes through different ways of reading, such that you can see the effects of punctuation, and where punctuation it might be, what punctuation might communicate, right? So punctuation really, for lack of a better explanation, punctuation is basically cues for how a statement should be read, right? Or perhaps how the author may intend the statement to be read. Um, my background is actually in poetry, right? So I spent a lot of time looking at um, looking at phrases and lines on the level of the phrase and the level of the sentence and so on. And when you look at stuff with that degree of precision, punctuation begins to matter, because you're wondering, well, why did the author put a comma here? Or why is there a dash here? Why is there no punctuation? Right. I mean, W.S. Merwin did at least one entire book with no punctuation in it whatsoever. Right. So this article kind of delves into um, you know helpful evaluation of punctuation, right? So again, I would definitely recommend you reading it, definitely recommend you delving into it. But a lot of these articles, like the what's your favorite as your favorite grammar rule is probably fake, that kind of thing. That really those really there's some a lot of those have URLs in them where you can click and you can find out more information, etc., and so on. Um, and then, does grammar really matter? It's a short video that delves into these questions, and it sort of creates a dialectic, right? Where you've got the prescriptivist versus the descriptivist. And the prescriptive method, or prescriptive point of view, is that there are certain ways that grammar should be, and this is what it is, and this is how to go about sort of meshing your writing into these nice little prescriptions, right? And that's where style manuals come in. Still to this day, you have people that swear up and down by Strunk and White's The Elements of Style. And granted, and it basically is the book upon which basically any grammatical manual, style handbook, whatever, is based on still, right? Is Strunk and White's The Elements of Style. But it's very prescriptivist, right? It's very much, okay, commas go here. Da, da, da. You need a comma after this many words. When if you start a sentence with a dependent clause, you need a comma, so on and so forth, right? It gets into all of those details, and that's a prescriptivist idea. The descriptivist idea is to approach punctuation as more fluid, based on how language actually is used, right? So um, it's pretty safe to say that our department really kind of flows into the descriptivist for the most part. But anyway, it's a nice video. And again, I encourage you to take a look at it. Let's look at the assignments that are due for the week. Got your labor log, of course, your writing task for week 10. This is just like we did for the last project. It's asking you to create a draft of your project. Again, the draft is a draft. It doesn't have to be complete per se, but it should contain the crux of what your argument is, what you're going for, um, and why, right? You may not have all your evidence in place. You may not have borne it all out, okay, but it should um, bear out your basic idea, right? And again, if you're looking at these pieces, these readings, right? Um, you're getting you're getting a pretty good idea, right, of different directions you can go in. Again, also infused with your own insight, um, your own experiences with being writers in the classroom, for example, or if you're doing the ethnographic study, being potential scholars in your program, and if you have um, worked up an interview with a professor, uh, or something like that, you may maybe talk to a couple of professors, maybe talk to some students, maybe talk to some seniors or some graduate students in your potential program. You might uh, you might have a lot to go on because you might be like, well, hey, I wasn't expecting it to be like this. Hey, or you could really be excited, right? You should be like, this is exactly what I expected. I can't wait to get in, I can't wait to get into my junior year and declare my major and really get going with this, right? So anyway, I'm really excited about what y'all are going to come up with because I know that not only are you capable of doing these projects, but that these projects, particularly the ethnographic study, if you choose to take that on, um, I think can be very beneficial to you. Um, okay, so getting back on track here, we've got the writing tasks. We've got labor journal 3. So your labor journal 2s were great. Okay, you're really getting into the process, into the habit of doing the labor logs every week and so forth. And the labor journal 3 is um, just like labor journals 1 and 2. Labor journal 4 will be different, okay, but we'll sort of address that when we come to it. Um, and then your reading notes for week 11. Now remember, week 11's readings are in the week 11 folder and or on the outside of the folder, if there's a video link like this one here. Okay. I'm gonna try something. Um, we'll see if this is gonna work for us. So it's safe to say that
With Verizon, when you bundle mobile and home internet, you save $15 a month and can get the entertainment you love included on us.
all right. I apologize for that. So it's safe to say that Weird Al is probably a prescriptionist, although he's a satirist. So he's, that's all in good fun. But there are a lot of folks that still feel the way that Weird Al speaker felt in that song. And if there was, I couldn't tell if there was problems with the audio or not on my end. But you can always look up that video and watch it and listen to it. It's really funny. Um, Particularly if you've ever heard someone just go on and on about uh, religiously about grammar rules and so on. Uh, but anyway, have a good week, and I will talk to you all later. Thank you so much.